The word hit Dorothy Shepard like a fist to the sternum. "You are not our father." 8-year-old Thomas said it first, and then 11-year-old Clara echoed it, her voice cracking with a rage that sounded too old for her small body. They stood in the doorway of the barn in the late afternoon light of September 1878, their faces flushed, and their fists balled at their sides, and Cyrus Brenner, who had ridden 60 miles of hard Texas scrubland to reach this ranch, who had spent 4 months earning every inch of trust in this household, stood very still in the hay-scattered dirt, and let their words land exactly where they intended. Dorothy did not move from the fence post where she had been standing. Her hands had gone white around the worn cedar rail. She had heard everything, every single word. Cyrus crouched down so that he was level with Thomas, and Dorothy watched him take off his hat, that battered brown felt hat she had seen him wear through rainstorms and cattle drives, and the kind of exhaustion that hollows a man out from the inside. He held it in both hands, and he looked at her children with eyes so steady and so honest that something broke open in Dorothy's chest. "You are absolutely right," he said. "I am not your father. I am not here to replace anyone. I am only here to stay beside her." Thomas's face crumpled. Clara turned and ran. Dorothy finally let go of the fence. The story of how Cyrus Brenner had come to crouch in the dust of the Shepard Ranch and say those words to 2 grieving children did not begin simply. It began 8 months earlier, in the raw February cold of 1878, when Dorothy Shepard had buried her husband, James, in the frozen ground behind the cottonwood grove, and come back to her kitchen table with 2 children clinging to her coat, and a ranch debt that the bank in Caldwell, Kansas, had been patient about for exactly as long as James was alive. She had been 29 years old. The debt was $412. The cattle herd numbered 43 head. The hired man, old Pete Garvey, had his own back problems and could not ride the fence lines anymore. And the winter that year was the kind that seemed to have a dark secret hidden inside it, arriving early and staying long, as though it had a personal grudge against the southern plains. James Shepard had been a good man. Dorothy believed this without question, and without the kind of gilded mythology that grief sometimes plasters over a man's true face. He had been steady and hardworking, a man who had homesteaded their 300 acres on nothing but stubborn will, and a wife who matched him in stubbornness. He had loved his children with a quiet fierceness that showed up in small ways, the way he always saved the best cut of meat for Thomas and Clara, the way he told bedtime stories in voices so ridiculous that even Dorothy laughed into her pillow. He had died of a fever that came on fast and departed even faster, taking everything with it. Pneumonia, the doctor in Caldwell had said, arriving 3 days after the fact. Dorothy had cried for 2 weeks straight, and then she had stopped, not because the grief was gone, but because crying was a luxury she could not afford when there were cattle to feed, and a roof with a rotting corner board, and 2 children who needed their mother standing upright. She had written to her cousin in Abilene asking for advice about ranch management. She had read every agricultural pamphlet she could get her hands on. She had ridden the fence lines herself, in her dead husband's coat that was 3 sizes too large, and she had learned that 3 sections of the north fence had come down in the January windstorm. It was Pete Garvey who had first mentioned Cyrus Brenner. Pete had known Cyrus from a cattle drive they had both worked on some years back, a long push from South Texas up the Kishom Trail, and Pete said that Cyrus was one of those men who could look at a sick calf and tell you exactly what was wrong with it, who could read weather in the smell of the air, who could handle a horse with so much gentleness that even a green-broke animal seemed to understand it was being asked rather than forced. "He is between outfits right now," Pete had told Dorothy, standing at the kitchen door with his hat in his hand. His last employer, a man named Holloway up in Wichita County, sold off his whole spread. "Cyrus has been working day wages over near Medicine Lodge, but that is no kind of life for a man like him. You need someone who knows cattle, Mrs. Shepard. I can mend fence and feed hay, but I cannot do what needs doing here come spring." Dorothy had thought about it for 3 days. She had prayed about it, which was her habit when a decision felt bigger than her own judgment. She had sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and stared at the account ledger and stared at the debt number and stared at the map of the ranch she had drawn from memory, with all its problems marked in red pencil. On the 4th day, she had asked Pete to send word to Cyrus Brenner. Cyrus arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-March, riding a bay horse he called Sable, with a bedroll, a saddle bag, a Winchester repeater in the scabbard, and a look about him that Dorothy could only describe as careful. He was 34 years old, tall and lean in the way that outdoor living makes a man lean, with brown hair that needed cutting and dark eyes that moved across the ranch yard with the quiet, assessing look of someone reading a situation before committing to any particular response. He had broad hands and a jaw that needed shaving, and he smelled of horse and wood smoke, and he stood in her doorway and said, "Mrs. Shepard, Pete says you need help." "I do," Dorothy had said. "Come in." They had talked for an hour at the kitchen table. Dorothy had laid out every problem: the debt, the fence, the condition of the herd, the spring roundup that she could not manage alone, the need to get cattle to the rail at Caldwell by summer. She had not softened any of it. She had not added polite cushioning to the hard edges of how dire things were, because she did not think it would do either of them any good to start a working arrangement on false pretenses. Cyrus had listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical and precise, and they told Dorothy a great deal about what kind of man he was. He asked about the water supply, about what the herd's condition was coming out of winter, and about whether the ranch had a note with the bank or a private arrangement. She answered each question fully. He sat with his hands wrapped around the coffee cup she had given him, and he thought for a moment, and then he said, "I can fix this. Not overnight, but by fall, if we work hard, you ought to be in a position to pay down the debt and keep enough back to winter the herd properly." "What are your terms?" Dorothy asked. He named a fair wage, slightly below what a foreman of his experience would normally command, and Dorothy suspected this was deliberate kindness, though she would not have called him on it. He asked for a bunk in the barn, or if there was a small outbuilding there, and he said he would take his meals separately if she preferred. "The kitchen table seats 4, Dorothy said, "and I am not cooking 2 sets of meals." That was the beginning. The beginning of the work was entirely about the ranch. Cyrus was up before dawn every morning, and Dorothy often heard him from her bedroom window. The sound of his boots in the yard, the low murmur of his voice talking to the horses in their quiet early morning language. He had an ease with animals that was something close to remarkable, not the flashy showmanship of a man trying to impress, but the deep, patient ease of someone for whom the language of horses and cattle was simply native. The way some people move through a crowded room without bumping into anyone because they have an innate sense of space and motion. The fence was the first project. Cyrus worked it systematically, starting from the north because the winter damage was worst there, and he worked from sunup to the last light without complaint. Pete helped where his back allowed. Dorothy rode out with them on the 3rd day, not to supervise, but because staying inside when there was physical work to be done felt dishonest to her, and she dug post holes and strung wire alongside them while Thomas and Clara stayed with old Mrs. Garfield 2 miles down the road. Cyrus said nothing about her working the fence line. He showed her the correct technique for setting a corner post without wasted motion, and she followed the instruction, and that was that. In the evenings they ate at the kitchen table. The first few nights were quiet in the way that strange situations make people quiet, the polite, slightly stiff quiet of people who are not yet sure of the rules. Thomas was suspicious, the way boys of 8 are suspicious of any change in the order of things. Clara, at 11, was more complicated. She watched Cyrus with a careful, measuring look, as though she were running a private assessment that she would report to no one. The ice at the table began to thaw the night that Cyrus, without any fanfare, began telling a story about a cattle drive that had gone badly wrong due to a thunderstorm and a dry creek bed that turned into a raging river in the space of 30 minutes. He told it well. He had the gift of detail, not excess detail that bogs a story down, but the right details, the ones that make a scene visible and alive. Thomas had leaned forward before he caught himself doing it, and Clara had stopped pretending to be interested only in her food. By the end of March, they were talking at the table like people who knew each other, not like family, nothing as loaded or as fraught as that, but like people who had found each other unexpectedly good company. Dorothy had told herself very firmly that this was a practical arrangement. Cyrus Brenner was an employee. He was a good one, competent and honest, and utterly without the kind of manipulation or hidden motive that Dorothy had been warned about by well-meaning neighbors who thought a widow alone on a ranch was vulnerable in every possible sense. She had watched for those things because she was not a foolish woman, and she had not found them. What she had found instead was a man who fixed things, not just fence posts and sick calves and rotting corner boards, though he fixed all of those. He fixed things in the small, quiet ways that were harder to name. He found Thomas's lost pocket knife and returned it without making a ceremony of it. He noticed that Clara loved horses, and he began, with Dorothy's silent permission, to teach her how to properly curry and handle them. He split enough firewood to last 3 winters and stacked it in the neat, precise way of someone who finds genuine satisfaction in order. And he never, in those first weeks, crossed any line he had not been invited across. April came with the green rush of it, the Texas plains doing what they always did in spring, going from brown and dead-looking to startlingly, almost violently alive in the space of a few warm rains. The cattle were coming out of winter in reasonable shape. The fence was 90% mended. Cyrus had identified 2 calving cows that needed watching, and he and Dorothy had taken turns with the night checks in the cold and the dark. And on one of those nights, waiting in the barn for a heifer who was taking her time about things, Dorothy had told Cyrus about James. She had not planned to. It had come out of the particular intimacy of a barn at 3 in the morning, when everything is very quiet and very close, and the ordinary defenses of daylight don't seem to apply. She talked about how they had met in Missouri, how James had been the worst dancer at a church social, and had known it and laughed at himself for it, how they had come west because James had believed in land with the kind of deep, religious conviction that some men had about gold or cattle or God. How he had loved this particular piece of land beyond reason and had passed that love on to the children before he died, which meant that the land was not just a financial problem but a living piece of their father that they were still carrying. Cyrus had listened in the way that he always listened, fully, without impatience, without filling the silence with useless noise. When she was done, he said, "He sounds like someone who deserved the life he built." It was exactly the right thing to say. Dorothy was not sure how he had known it was the right thing to say, but he had, and that small precision of feeling stayed with her. May was the first time Dorothy felt something she immediately identified as dangerous. They had been riding back from the north pasture after checking on a section of fence that had been knocked down again by a bull who had a talent for structural damage, and the late afternoon sun was the color of honey poured through amber glass, laying itself across the grass in long golden sheets, and Cyrus was riding beside her at an easy walk, saying something about the quality of the grazing grass compared to what he'd seen on ranches further south, and Dorothy had looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had been careful not to look at him, and something shifted inside her chest like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten existed. She had turned her horse slightly away so he could not see her face and had made a calm, practical remark about the West Pasture's water source, and Cyrus had responded in kind, and the moment had passed. But it had happened. Dorothy told herself it was loneliness. She told herself it was the particular vulnerability of being recently widowed and having a competent, decent man around on a constant basis. She told herself it was nothing more than the natural gratitude a woman in a difficult situation feels toward the person helping her out of it. She told herself these things with considerable conviction, and none of them were entirely wrong, and none of them were entirely sufficient. June brought the roundup, and with the roundup came the arrival of two problems Dorothy had not anticipated. The first was Harlan Brace. Harlan Brace was a land speculator from Wichita who had been moving through the southern Kansas and northern Texas border country for 2 years, buying up ranches from widows and struggling homesteaders at prices that were, to put it generously, well below fair market value. He operated with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who has learned that a certain kind of charm plus a certain kind of persistence equals a certain predictable result. He arrived at the Shepard Ranch on a hot June afternoon in a good buggy with a good suit, and he had an offer in his coat pocket. Dorothy knew his type before he opened his mouth. She had met Harlan Braces before, not this particular man, but this particular shape of man, with his secret agenda and his comfortable assumptions about what a woman alone would be willing to accept when the pressure was applied correctly. She listened to his offer, which was $250 for 300 acres, a number so insulting it was almost interesting in its audacity, and she thanked him politely and told him the ranch was not for sale. Brace smiled in the way of a man who has heard this before and considers it an opening position rather than a final answer. He said he would be in the area for a few days if she changed her mind. When he was gone, Dorothy found Cyrus in the barn and told him about the visit, not because she needed his permission or his protection, but because he was the person she had been talking to about everything for 4 months, and this felt like something he should know. Cyrus's expression did not change much. His eyes went quiet and attentive in a way she had learned to associate with him taking something seriously. He said, "Men like that come back." "I know," Dorothy said. "If he does, you want me around." It was not a question. It was an offer. Dorothy considered it for a moment and then said yes. The second problem in June was more complicated and more internal, and it had nothing to do with Harlan Brace. Clara had begun to cry. Not openly, not dramatically. She cried in the small, hidden ways of an 11-year-old girl who believes that everyone is watching and that visible grief is a form of weakness. She cried at night in her room, muffled sound through the wall that Dorothy heard and that pierced her to the bone. She cried once at the stable when she thought no one could see her, stroking the nose of the gray mare that James had always saddled first. The roundup was hard on the children because it was the first major ranch event since James had died, and James had loved the roundup with a boisterous, demonstrative energy that was very different from his usual quiet manner. He had made it a celebration. He had set things up in ways the children were used to, and now those ways were gone. Cyrus noticed Clara's distress in the way he noticed most things, quietly, without announcement. He did not say anything to Dorothy about it at first. What he did was invite Clara to help him sort the calves from the cows during the morning work, giving her a specific, important job that required her full attention and skill. He explained the work in detail and then trusted her to do it. She did it well, and he told her so plainly, without excessive praise that might have felt condescending. By the second day of the roundup, Clara was still grieving. She would grieve for a long time, because grief is not a project that gets finished. But she had something to do with her hands and her mind that was real and useful, and that helped. Dorothy watched all of this without saying anything to Cyrus about it. At night, after the children were in bed, she sat on the porch with a cup of cold coffee and felt the terrible, beautiful complication of what she was feeling and tried to decide what to do with it. She was not a woman who ran from hard things. She had proven that to herself multiple times in the last 6 months. But she was also not a woman who acted on feelings without thinking them through, and what she felt for Cyrus Brenner required a great deal of thinking through. Because the feelings were real. That was now impossible to deny. They were not the swept-away, giddy feelings of a girl. Dorothy had not been a girl for some time, but the deep, steady, inconvenient feelings of a grown woman who recognizes something she has been quietly wanting and has been trying, with limited success, not to want. She decided to say nothing and let time do what it usually did, which was either settle things or unsettle them more comprehensively. July was when Harlan Brace came back, and he came back with a different kind of pressure. He had, in the weeks since his first visit, been making inquiries. He had learned about the bank debt. He had spoken to someone at the bank in Caldwell. Dorothy would later discover it was a junior clerk with loose ethics and a gambling problem. And he had come back armed with the specific number of what she owed, and a revised offer that was slightly more reasonable but came attached to a timeline. He said the bank was likely to call in the note by fall if the payment could not be made, and he said this in the gentle, regretful tone of a man delivering bad news that happens to serve his purposes. Dorothy was in the kitchen when he arrived, and she came out to the porch to meet him, and Cyrus came out of the barn because he had seen the buggy, and because he had said he would be there. He did not say anything threatening to Brace. He simply stood on the porch steps with his thumbs in his belt loops and his dark eyes level and calm, and his presence made a very specific kind of statement without a word needing to be spoken. Brace recalibrated slightly. He addressed Dorothy with more directness and less performance, and Dorothy listened to his information about the bank and felt a cold thread of fear through her chest, and then she thanked him and said she had already made arrangements to make the payment before fall. She had not made any such arrangements, but she said it with absolute conviction. When Brace was gone, Cyrus looked at her from the porch steps, and she looked back at him, and he said, very quietly, "What arrangements?" "The ones I am going to make," Dorothy said, and she walked back inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time that evening with the ledger and the account book, and the tally of what the cattle drive to Caldwell should bring if the prices held. The numbers were close, very close, closer than comfortable but possibly workable if nothing went wrong between now and the end of August. Cyrus knocked on the door frame from the kitchen entrance and came in and sat down across from her, and she showed him the numbers, because pretending they did not exist served no one. He looked at them for a while. He said, "If we push the larger steers to market a week earlier than planned and trim the remuda to the horses we actually need versus the ones we're keeping for convenience, we get there." Dorothy looked at the math. He was right. "There is something else," Cyrus said, and he said it with a particular evenness that told her the something else was significant. "I have wages coming from my previous work with Holloway's outfit. He sold, but he settled his debts before he left the territory. There is $200 in a bank account in Medicine Lodge. I want to put it against the note." Dorothy looked up from the ledger. "No," she said. "It solves the problem," Cyrus said. "It is not your problem to solve," she said. "This is my ranch, my debt, my children's future. I will not begin that future by owing money to an employee in addition to owing money to a bank." Something moved across his face, not offense. Something more complicated than offense, something quieter and more private, and he was still for a moment before he said, "I understand." "Thank you," Dorothy said, and meant it with her whole chest. "But no." He nodded, and he got up and he went back to the barn. Dorothy sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after that, staring at the ledger, thinking about the word employee and how strange it had felt coming out of her mouth in relation to Cyrus Brenner, who had stopped feeling like an employee somewhere around April and had started feeling like something else entirely, something she did not yet have the right word for. August came with brutal heat and the cattle drive preparations and the particular exhaustion of a summer on a working ranch, and in the middle of all of it Dorothy got a letter from her sister-in-law, James's sister Margaret, in Missouri. Margaret's letter was kind in its intentions and dreadful in its effect. It said, among other things, that Margaret had heard through the family that Dorothy had hired a ranch hand who was living on the property, and that people were talking, and that Dorothy should think carefully about appearances for the sake of the children, and that if things were truly this difficult, surely there was some arrangement that could be made. Some arrangement being a politely coded suggestion that Dorothy consider selling and returning to Missouri, where she would be among family. Dorothy read the letter twice. She put it down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the stove, and watched it burn. She had nothing against Margaret, who was a decent woman doing what she thought was good and right according to her understanding of the world. But Dorothy was not going back to Missouri. She was not selling James's land. She was not sacrificing the future she was building, one post hole and one fence rail and one mended ledger at a time, because other people were uncomfortable with the particulars of how she was surviving. The drive to Caldwell went well. Cyrus organized it with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, hiring 2 additional temporary riders for the 2-week push north, and the cattle arrived in good condition, and the prices held, and Dorothy stood in the cattle buyer's office in Caldwell, Kansas on the 23rd of August, 1878, and watched him write numbers onto a bank draft, and the numbers were enough. They were exactly enough. On the way home from Caldwell, riding in the buckboard with Cyrus on the seat beside her, the 2 extra riders had been paid and dismissed in town. Dorothy was quiet for a long time. The late summer light was extraordinary, the way it sometimes was in Kansas at that angle in the season, honey and gold and the long blue shadows of evening just beginning to form, and the prairie grass moved around them in its familiar enormous way, like a slow green ocean. "We did it," she said. "You did it," Cyrus said. "We," Dorothy said firmly, and she looked at him and he looked back at her, and the thing that had been accumulating between them for 5 months was very suddenly very present in the space between the driver's seat of a buckboard on an empty Kansas road. Neither of them moved. The horses walked steadily forward. The grass moved. The light changed. Dorothy said, because she had decided to be a woman who did not pretend, "Cyrus, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right," he said. "Are you staying because of the work? Because there will always be more work on a ranch than I can pay fairly for, and I would rather know now if you are planning to move on so that I can—" "I am staying," he said. It was not a complicated answer. It had no qualifications in it. It was one of those statements that is so complete in itself that adding to it would only dilute it. Dorothy looked at her hands on the reins. She said, "I am not a woman who does things by halves. If you are staying, you should know that. I am not built for something halfway." "I know that," Cyrus said. "I have known that since March." The buckboard rolled on. The horses' hooves made their steady sound. Dorothy felt something inside her that she had been holding tightly, holding closed like a fist around something fragile, slowly open. She did not take his hand. Not yet. That was not how she was built. But she let herself sit closer on the seat than was strictly necessary, and Cyrus did not move away, and they rode back to the Shepard ranch in the September dusk, side by side. The children were the problem. Dorothy had known this was coming. She had thought about it in every spare moment of the past 5 months, because she was not a woman who ignored the hardest part of a situation. The children had lost their father. Their father had been a specific, irreplaceable person. The presence of any other man on their property, in their mother's life, in their daily existence, was going to register as a threat to that irreplaceability. Thomas had been managing his grief through action and stubbornness. He was 8 and he had strong opinions about everything, and he had increasingly strong opinions about Cyrus, opinions that ran in 2 contradictory directions and which Thomas was not yet mature enough to reconcile. He admired Cyrus. He had watched Cyrus handle horses and work cattle and fix broken things with a close, avid attention, the way boys of 8 attend to men they respect. And he hated himself for that admiration, because admiring Cyrus felt like a form of forgetting his father, and forgetting his father was the one thing Thomas was determined never to do. This was not unusual. It was not surprising. It was just true and hard, and it needed to be walked through carefully. Dorothy sat down with both children one evening in late August, a week before the drive to Caldwell. She told them plainly that Cyrus was going to continue working on the ranch. She did not hide that she valued his presence or that he was important to her. She did not dress it in the language of pure practicality because that would have been a lie and her children deserved better than lies. She told them that no one was asking them to feel any particular way about it. She told them that their father was their father and that nothing in the world changed that or dimmed it. Thomas said, "Is he going to marry you?" Dorothy said, "Nobody is getting married." "I am just telling you what is happening on our ranch right now." Clara said nothing. She watched her mother with her dark eyes, and Dorothy could not entirely read what was in them. It was the second week of September, after the Caldwell drive, after the money was in the bank, after the debt was paid in full with a small but meaningful amount left over, that the confrontation happened. The one that Cyrus had been waiting for, that Dorothy had feared and expected and prayed about in equal measure. She had not seen it building toward that specific moment. She had been in the house going over the remaining accounts when she heard Thomas's voice from the direction of the barn, raised and sharp in the way of a child saying something they have been working up to for weeks. She had come out to the porch and heard most of it before she reached the fence. Thomas standing in the barn doorway, Clara beside him, both of their faces flushed with the effort of a feeling too large for their small bodies, the accusation landing clear and final in the dust of the yard. "You are not our father." And then Cyrus's hat coming off, his hand steady around the brim, his eyes finding the level of an 8-year-old boy's and holding there. "You are absolutely right. I am not your father. I am not here to replace anyone. I am only here to stay beside her." Thomas's face crumpled. Clara turned and ran. Dorothy came off the porch step. She went at Thomas first because he was standing there, frozen in his own feelings, and she knelt in the dirt and pulled him against her, and he was stiff at first. The way boys of 8 are when they are trying very hard not to cry, and then he wasn't stiff anymore, and he cried into her shoulder with his whole body in the shaking, shattering way of a child who has been holding something for too long. Dorothy held him and held him. She looked up over his head and found Cyrus standing a few feet away, hat still in his hands, watching her with an expression that was so carefully still, so deliberately neutral, that she could see exactly how much it was costing him to be neutral. She mouthed, "Thank you." He looked at the ground. Then she said to Thomas softly, "Go inside and get cleaned up. Supper in an hour." Thomas pulled back and wiped his face with the back of his hand with fierce dignity and walked to the house. She watched him go. Then she turned and went to find Clara. Clara was behind the stable, sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, looking out at the pasture where the horses were grazing in the late afternoon light. Her face was wet, but she had stopped crying. She had the particular composure of a girl who has decided that tears are done and thinking is now required. Dorothy climbed up and sat beside her on the fence rail. They were quiet together for a while. Finally Clara said, "He did not have to say it like that." "No," Dorothy agreed. "He chose to." Another silence. A horse moved in the pasture, dark against the golden grass. Clara said, "Do you love him?" Dorothy looked at her daughter. 11 years old, with James's eyes and Dorothy's stubbornness, and a mind that had always moved faster than most adults gave it credit for. She considered lying or softening or redirecting. She decided against all three. "I think I am getting there," she said honestly. "I have not been anywhere close to ready for that for a long time, but yes, I think I am getting there." Clara absorbed this. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He is not like Papa." "No," Dorothy said. "He is not. He is someone else, someone different." "Papa was louder," Clara said. "Funnier, always making noise." "Yes. Cyrus is quiet," Clara said. It was an observation, not a criticism. "He is." Clara looked at the horses. She said with the solemn authority of an 11-year-old making a considered judgment, "I suppose quiet is all right." Dorothy laughed. She could not help it. It came out of her chest sudden and real, and Clara looked startled for a moment, and then she laughed too, and they sat on the fence rail in the September light and laughed until there were tears on both their faces again. Different tears this time. the lighter kind. Cyrus came to find Dorothy after supper, when the children were in bed. He came to the porch where she was sitting in the cooling evening air, and he sat down in the other chair, and for a while they did not say anything. Then he said, "I should have thought more carefully about how the children would take Cyrus," Dorothy said. "You were perfect." He was quiet. "What you said to Thomas," she said, "it was exactly right. You did not try to fix his feelings or change them or tell him how he ought to feel. You just told him the truth." "It is the truth," he said simply. "I know," she said. The night was very still. The stars over the Kansas plain were the full, overwhelming kind that you only see far from any settlement, each one particular and bright. Dorothy looked at them for a moment, and then she looked at Cyrus, and he was already looking at her. She said, "What are we doing, Cyrus?" He said, "What do you want to be doing?" "I want to know what you want," she said. "I have been watching you for 6 months, and you are very good at not wanting things out loud." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I want to be here, on this ranch, with you and those children. I have wanted that since about the 3rd week of April, and I have been extremely careful about it because it is your life and your choice and your land, and I was not going to presume." Dorothy felt the careful, tightly held thing in her chest complete its slow opening. She reached out and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair. His hand turned over under hers, and he held it. They sat like that for a long time without speaking, in the dark Kansas night with the stars above them, and the horses quiet in the pasture, and the ranch all around them, mended and solvent and alive. October unfolded the way October did in that country, the grass going gold and rust, the mornings arriving with a sharp bite that announced the seriousness of the coming season, the sky taking on the high, pale blue clarity of autumn. There was winter preparation to think about, laying and feed, banking the foundation of the house against the cold, making sure the herd was in good condition for the months ahead. Cyrus and Dorothy worked side by side through it all, and something had changed between them since the night on the porch. Not dramatically. Nothing in Dorothy's life or Cyrus's nature moved dramatically. But the careful, measured distance they had been maintaining had been quietly set aside, and in its place was something warmer and more certain, a steady knowing of each other that felt like the best kind of foundation. He touched her without hesitation now when touch was natural, a hand on her arm to catch her attention, a steadying hand when she climbed down from the ladder after checking the roof's condition, the particular closeness of standing together at the kitchen table going over plans. And she let herself lean slightly into those moments rather than maintaining the strict, polite separation of their early months. The children adjusted with the gradual, unannounced pragmatism of children, who are fundamentally resilient when they feel secure. Thomas began asking Cyrus questions about cattle management and horse training with less suspicion, and more of the unguarded curiosity of a boy learning from a man he respects. He did not, as far as Dorothy could observe, see this as a betrayal of his father. He was beginning to understand, in the wordless way of children, that love is not a finite resource where giving some to one person means taking it from another. Clara was more deliberate about it. She was 11, and she thought about things with more conscious intention than Thomas did. And she made small, specific decisions to include Cyrus in ways that were unmistakably voluntary. She asked him to check the gray mare's left foreleg, which she was worried about. She showed him the drawings she had been making in her notebook, careful, detailed drawings of horses and ranch scenes. She asked him once quietly when they were both in the stable and Dorothy was not nearby, "Did you have a family before?" Cyrus had looked at her with the direct, respectful attention he always gave her, and he said, "I have not. It has just been me for a long time. And I think that is a part of why your mother's family means what it means to me." Clara had looked at him for a moment, and then she had gone back to her horse, and if there was something unlocked in her expression after that, it was subtle enough that she could keep the dignity of it to herself. November arrived, and with it came a second visit from Harlan Brace, and this time he was not polite about it. He came with another man, a large man Dorothy did not recognize, and he arrived on a weekday morning when, had his information been correct, Cyrus should have been in the north pasture moving cattle to the winter grazing land. But his information was not correct, because Cyrus had come back early due to a heifer with a limping issue, and so when Brace drove his buggy into the yard and saw Cyrus in the barn doorway, something in his prepared manner faltered slightly. Brace's offer this time was not really an offer. It was a statement of what he believed to be inevitable. He said he had spoken again to his contact at the bank, the same disreputable clerk, and that there were questions about the legality of the fall payment, some suggestion of accounting irregularities, and that the bank might be reconsidering the full satisfaction of the debt. This was, Dorothy knew immediately, a lie. The bank had sent her a letter of receipt. The debt was paid and documented. What Brace was doing was a form of the oldest pressure technique available, inventing a problem and then positioning himself as the solution. She felt cold fury rising in her chest, clean and clarifying. She said, "Mr. Brace, I have a letter from the Bank of Caldwell, signed by the bank manager himself, stating that the note is paid in full. I have that letter in the house. Would you like me to get it?" Brace's expression shifted. The large man with him said nothing. Cyrus said from the barn doorway, his voice entirely conversational, "Mrs. Shepard, do you want me to ride to Caldwell and fetch the sheriff? I was planning to go for supplies this week anyway." It was said pleasantly. It was perfectly polite, and it was the clearest possible statement of what the consequence of continuing this conversation would be. Harlan Brace looked at Dorothy and he looked at Cyrus and he performed a rapid internal calculation. He said stiffly that he had perhaps been given incorrect information by his contact and that he was sorry to have troubled her. He got back in his buggy. The large man got in beside him. They drove away. Dorothy watched the buggy until it was a small dark shape on the prairie road, and then she let out a long, slow breath. "He will not be back," Cyrus said, coming to stand beside her. "How do you know?" "Men like that are running a numbers game," Cyrus said. "They move from property to property looking for the ones that are weak enough to fall. When they find resistance that has teeth, they move on. There is always another vulnerable piece of ground somewhere." Dorothy looked at him. "That is a dark way of looking at the world." "It is an accurate way," he said, not unkindly. "And this particular property is not weak anymore." Dorothy felt something in that sentence that was bigger than just the ranch. She turned to look at him and he was already looking at her, and it was a moment that was private and full and said several things without using words, which was Cyrus Brenner's particular language. "No," she said quietly, "it is not." December brought the hard cold and the shorter days and the particular closeness of a household hunkered down against winter. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and it became the center of their shared evenings in a way that felt natural and good. Dorothy mending or reading, Clara with her drawings or her schoolwork, Thomas with the checker set or a book borrowed from the schoolteacher in the nearest settlement, and Cyrus in the chair by the stove, reading or doing accounts or simply being still in the way that some people can be still, not restlessly but like a rock in a stream, quietly and completely present. It was in December that Cyrus kissed Dorothy for the first time. It happened in the kitchen, which was the most practical and least romantic setting imaginable, which struck Dorothy afterward as entirely appropriate to the both of them. She had been at the counter measuring flour for bread, and she had turned around and he was close behind her, closer than she had realized, and for a moment they were both just still, looking at each other, and then he put his hand against her cheek, very carefully, as though asking a question with his palm, and she leaned into it by way of answer, and he kissed her softly and briefly, and then looked at her face with those dark eyes that gave away everything if you knew how to look. She kissed him back less briefly, and his hands came to her waist, and the bread got made considerably later than planned. Neither of them said anything particularly coherent for a while, and then Dorothy said, The children will be home from the schoolhouse in an hour." "I know," Cyrus said. "This is something we need to handle very carefully," she said. "I know," he said again. "Which means," she said, because she was not a woman who allowed herself to be unclear on important things, "that I need to know your intentions before we take another step forward." He looked at her. He said, "My intentions are to marry you, Dorothy, if you will have me, and to spend the rest of my life on this ranch and to love those children without requiring them to call me anything other than what they choose." Dorothy held this for a moment. She felt it settle into her chest like something coming home. She said, "When?" He blinked. He had perhaps expected more negotiation. "When do you want to get married?" she said. He said, "Tomorrow would suit me, but I suspect you need more than a day." She laughed, full and warm. "Spring," she said. "After the worst of the mud is past, I want to have a proper celebration." "Spring," he agreed. She offered him her hand in the formal way, palm upturned, and he took it in both of his and held it. And that was how they got engaged, standing in a Kansas ranch kitchen that smelled of flour and wood smoke, with the wind finding the corners of the house outside and the children an hour away and their whole shared future ahead of them, clear and open and real. Telling the children was the next thing. Dorothy sat them down at the kitchen table 2 days after the engagement. She had spent those 2 days thinking carefully about how to do it, and she told them plainly that she and Cyrus were planning to get married in the spring. She told them that this was her decision and that Cyrus had made his feelings clear to her and that she loved him. She used the word. She did not soften it into something more comfortable. She thought her children deserved the truth of her feelings and not a diplomatic paraphrase. Thomas was very quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Are we going to have to call him Pa?" "No," Dorothy said. "You may call him whatever you choose. He will not tell you what that ought to be." Thomas nodded, processing this. Clara said, "I think I would like to choose Cyrus, just Cyrus." "All right," Dorothy said. Thomas thought for another moment and then he said, with the elaborate carefulness of a boy making a significant pronouncement, "I might call him Cyrus too, or maybe something else later. I have not decided." Dorothy said, "That is entirely up to you." Thomas gave a short, decisive nod as though this settled the matter. Then he said, "Is there pie tonight?" Dorothy laughed so hard she had to cover her face with her hands. The engagement changed the texture of the household in the subtlest and most profound ways. Cyrus moved from the barn bunk into the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage. A transition that satisfied propriety, without requiring either of them to pretend the situation was something other than it was. And the evenings became something Dorothy had not expected to have again after James died, which was the deep, quiet richness of a home with a person in it who chose to be there. January and February tested them with weather in the way that Kansas always tests, the wind coming down from the north with a violence that seemed personal, temperatures dropping to the kind of cold that turns breath to frost on your scarf before you have taken 3 steps from the door. There were cattle to see to, horses to check, a section of the barn roof that needed emergency repair in a February ice storm that arrived with no warning at 3 in the morning. Dorothy and Cyrus worked the storm together in the dark, in the howling wind, by lantern light, nailing boards over the damaged section while the cattle shifted and complained below them. It was the kind of miserable, physically difficult work that strips away everything unnecessary and shows you exactly who someone is. And what Dorothy saw in that lantern light, Cyrus moving methodically, efficiently, without panic, calling instructions to her over the wind in a voice that was calm and direct, was entirely consistent with everything she had seen of him since March. When they came in from the cold at 5 in the morning, wet and exhausted, she made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and he looked at her and said, "You are a remarkable woman." "I am a practical one," she said. "I know," he said, "which is part of why you are remarkable." She reached across the table and held his hand, and they drank their coffee in the gray pre-dawn silence, and both of them were exactly where they wanted to be. March arrived with its particular wild weather, oscillating between bitter cold and sudden warmth and back again, the ground going from frozen to mud to almost dry and back to mud. And with March came the spring preparations and the planning for the wedding in earnest. Dorothy had decided on April. A Saturday in the middle of April when the mud should be manageable, and the weather might, with some goodwill from the universe, be mild. She wrote to her cousin in Abilene, the one who had given her the advice about ranch management the previous year, and told her about the wedding, and the cousin wrote back with genuine happiness and said she would make the trip. She did not write to Margaret in Missouri. She wrote to James's brother instead, a more straightforward man named Daniel, and told him about Cyrus in plain terms. And Daniel wrote back a short, warm letter that said he was glad Dorothy had found someone decent, and that he trusted her judgment. The children were cautiously positive about the wedding in the way of children who are still watching to see if they can trust the permanence of a thing. Thomas announced one evening at supper that he had decided to call Cyrus by his full name, which he stated with such solemn formality that both Dorothy and Cyrus had to work very hard to keep their faces straight. Clara said nothing publicly, but Dorothy found her, one afternoon, in the small room that served as Cyrus's quarters, not snooping but standing quietly in the doorway looking at the few personal items Cyrus had arranged on the shelf above the window: a small photograph, a pocket watch, a book with a broken spine, with the expression of a girl carefully mapping the interior life of someone she is deciding to trust. Dorothy did not interrupt her. The wedding day was the 12th of April, 1879. The weather was exactly right. One of those spring Kansas mornings that seem to make an effort: clear sky, soft air, the kind of light that makes everything look as though it has been recently washed. The cousin from Abilene had arrived the day before with her husband and stayed the night. Pete Garvey, who had been responsible for everything that had led to this day, was there in his good shirt and his mended pants, blinking sentiment out of his eyes with fierce masculine dignity. 2 neighboring ranch families came, people Dorothy had known for years, good people who had showed up with food and help during the hard winter after James died, and who were now showing up again for a different kind of day. The ceremony was performed by a circuit minister who arrived that morning on a reliable-looking horse, and who had a warm, unhurried manner that suited the occasion. It took place on the porch, because the day was too good to be inside, with the prairie spread out behind the ceremony in its enormous spring green, the cottonwoods along the creek already showing their early leaves, pale and transparent and tender. Dorothy wore her best dress, the blue one she had put away after James died, and she had thought carefully about wearing it and decided that James would have wanted her to look well and be happy. She wore her hair pinned up with the tortoiseshell combs her mother had given her years ago. Clara had braided a strand of early wildflowers from the creek bank and put them in her mother's hair without being asked, with such careful, concentrated love that Dorothy had stood very still and felt something fill up in her chest that was almost too large to contain. Cyrus stood at the end of the porch in his good shirt and a jacket Dorothy had not seen before, clean-shaved, his brown hair combed, and when she came out to stand beside him he looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so fully present that she felt it like a warm hand against her sternum. They said their vows. Dorothy's voice was steady. Cyrus's voice was steady. When the minister pronounced them married and Cyrus kissed her, Thomas made a sound from the yard that was part embarrassment and part something else, and Clara stood beside her brother and watched with those dark eyes of hers, full of everything she would not quite say. The celebration afterward was simple and genuine, the kind that doesn't need embellishment because the feeling behind it is real enough. There was food and conversation, and a fiddle player from one of the neighboring families who played dance tunes in the barn, while the adults stood around the walls and some of them danced in the cleared space. Cyrus danced with Dorothy, and he was not, in fact, a gifted dancer. He moved with the careful, deliberate effort of a man following a map rather than a feeling. And this made Dorothy love him more than if he had been graceful, because it meant he was trying. He danced once with Clara, who went along with it with the slightly mortified dignity of an 11-year-old being led around a barn floor, and who Dorothy could see, watching from the side, was secretly pleased. Thomas did not dance, but he stood next to Cyrus for most of the evening, and once Dorothy saw him reach up and tug once on Cyrus's jacket sleeve to get his attention and say something, and Cyrus bent down to hear it. And whatever Thomas said, Cyrus's answer made Thomas nod with the decisive certainty of someone who has received a satisfactory response. That night, when the guests had gone or settled in the house and the barn was quiet again, Dorothy and Cyrus sat on the porch together in the warm spring dark, and she was aware of him as her husband in a way that was both entirely new and somehow also deeply familiar, the way some things feel like a homecoming to a place you have never actually been. He said, looking at the stars, "You know what struck me today?" "What?" she said. "The children were laughing," he said. "Both of them, not once, all day." Dorothy looked at the stars. She felt the truth of this settle through her. She said, "Yes, they were." "Whatever comes next," he said, "I want to be the reason for more days like this." "You already are," Dorothy said. He turned to look at her and she turned to look at him, and the night was enormous around them, and the ranch was quiet, and their whole life stretched forward into the dark, full of everything they had not yet done. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because nothing real and living is without difficulty. The summer of 1879 brought a drought that tested every ranch in the county and required hard decisions about water and feed. Cyrus managed it with the same methodical calm that Dorothy had come to rely on completely, and they came through it with the herd reduced but intact. The winter of 1880 was brutal, and they lost 3 cattle to cold in a single bad week and were awake every night for 10 days running, checking the herd. Through all of it, the children grew. Thomas turned 9, 10, 11. He was becoming a person of considerable determination and capability, and he worked alongside Cyrus on the ranch with a seriousness that both Dorothy and Cyrus found both admirable and slightly amusing. Somewhere in the course of 1879, Thomas had arrived at his decision about what to call Cyrus, which he announced one morning at the breakfast table with the formality of a treaty signing. "I am going to call you Cy," he said. "Not Pa, just Cy." Cyrus said, "That suits me perfectly." Thomas nodded. This was settled. He went back to his eggs. Clara turned 12, 13, 14. She was becoming a young woman of sharp intelligence and considerable artistic talent. The drawing she had started in her notebook had expanded into a real practice, and Dorothy had ordered her proper drawing paper and charcoal sticks from a catalog, and Clara drew the ranch and the horses and the landscape and the people in it with an accuracy and feeling that made grown adults stop and look twice. She drew Cyrus once, a detailed portrait from memory, and left it on his shelf without comment. He found it in the morning and said nothing to Clara directly, but he moved the drawing to the most visible spot on the shelf, and it stayed there. The second year of the marriage brought something that Dorothy had not dared to fully hope for in those early months. She was pregnant. She told Cyrus in October of 1879, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening, and he went very still in the way he went still when something mattered more than his usual composure could quite contain. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put both his hands over both of hers, very deliberately, and he said, "Dorothy," just her name. But the way he said it was a whole paragraph. "I know," she said. His eyes were bright. She had never seen his eyes like that before. She found it beautiful. "How are you?" he asked. "Strong," she said. "I am always strong." He squeezed her hands. "Yes," he said with the particular certainty of a man who has had considerable evidence of this. "You are." They told the children together. Clara went very quiet, and then her whole face changed into something open and wondering. Thomas said, "Is it going to be a boy?" "We do not know yet," Dorothy said. "I want a brother," Thomas said. "I am outnumbered by girls already." I am one girl, Clara said. That is not outnumbered. Mama is also a girl, Thomas pointed out. The horse you named after yourself is also a girl, Clara said. You have a pattern. This devolved into the usual Thomas and Clara argument that both Dorothy and Cyrus found deeply comforting in its complete normality, and by the time it wound down, the news of the baby had been entirely absorbed into the household in the practical, undramatic way that the Shepard-Brenner household absorbed most things. The baby was born in June of 1880, on a hot morning that arrived early and left no doubt about the seriousness of summer. The labor was hard. Dorothy was not a woman who pretended otherwise afterward, and Cyrus spent 6 hours outside the bedroom door in a state of controlled terror that Pete Garvey, who had been summoned from his nearby homestead to help with the ranch while the house was occupied with other matters, observed with the amused sympathy of an older man watching a younger one meet the full weight of domestic anxiety for the first time. The baby was a boy. He was healthy and large and extremely vocal about his opinions, and when Dorothy held him for the first time and then held him up for Cyrus to see, Cyrus's face did the thing it had done when she told him she was pregnant went still, and then broke open into something undefended and completely honest. He held the baby with the same careful, attentive precision he brought to everything, and the baby, after a brief period of objection, seemed to find this satisfactory and quieted. "What do we call him?" Dorothy asked. Cyrus thought for a moment, then he said, "James." Dorothy looked at him. Something moved through her that was very complex and very large, a feeling that needed its own word and did not quite have one. She said, "Are you certain?" "His grandfather deserves to be remembered," Cyrus said, "and Thomas and Clara deserve to know that we remember." Dorothy held her husband's gaze for a long time. Then she said, "James Cyrus Brenner." Cyrus said, "That is a strong name." "He looks like a strong person," Dorothy said. When the children were brought in to meet their new brother, Clara first, then Thomas with studied nonchalance that dissolved immediately at his first sight of the baby. The moment that happened was one that Dorothy stored carefully in the archive of her best memories. Thomas reached out one finger and the baby wrapped his hand around it with the fierce, instinctive grip of the newborn, and Thomas's whole face went entirely unguarded with wonder. "He is very small," Thomas said. "You were very small once," Dorothy said. "I doubt that," Thomas said with perfect seriousness, and even Cyrus laughed. Clara held the baby with a natural ease that suggested she was going to be excellent at this, and she looked at him for a long time and then she looked at Cyrus and said, "He has your nose." Cyrus looked startled. Then he looked at the baby. He said, "You think so?" "Yes," Clara said firmly. There was something in the way she said it, a deliberate claim, an intentional placement of Cyrus into the family's physical narrative. That was one of the most meaningful things anyone said to him that day, and Dorothy could see from his expression that he knew it. The baby James grew. The ranch grew. The years moved in the way of years on a working ranch, full and hard and seasonal, each year teaching them something, each year building on what the last one had laid down. Cyrus bought out Pete Garvey's small adjacent holding when Pete decided at last to retire and go live with his daughter in Topeka. He paid a fair price, more than fair, and Pete said gruffly that it was too much, and Cyrus said it was exactly right, and Pete said all right then. This added another 60 acres to the Shepard Ranch, which Dorothy had quietly begun calling the Brenner Ranch in her mind, though the deeds still read the original name. One evening in 1881, when James was nearly a year old and learning to be very definite about where he wanted to go and what he intended to pick up and examine, Dorothy came to Cyrus with a piece of paper. She set it in front of him at the kitchen table. It was a draft for changing the property title, from the Shepard Ranch to the Brenner Shepard Ranch. Cyrus looked at it for a long moment. He said, "Dorothy, the Shepard name stays because it is the children's name too," she said. "And because James built this land, but you have built it too for 3 years now. This is your home. I want the deed to say so." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said very simply, "Thank you." She reached across and put her hand over his, the way she had on that first porch night years ago, and he held it in both of his, and that was that. Thomas, by the time he was 12, was spending more time with cattle and horses than almost any other activity, and Cyrus was teaching him the specifics of herd management with the patient, precise attention he brought to teaching anything. Clara, at 15, was beginning to talk about attending a school in Caldwell that offered more advanced education than the small settlement schoolhouse, and Dorothy and Cyrus were already planning how to make that possible. The winter of 1881 brought a small but significant event. A neighboring family's ranch burned, and the family, a young couple with a new infant and no extended family anywhere near, found themselves without a home in December. Dorothy did not hesitate for one day. She opened the spare room that had been Cyrus's before the wedding and told them they were staying until spring, and they could sort things out properly with the warmth of a full season ahead of them. Cyrus organized the effort to help rebuild their barn and outbuildings when the weather broke in March. He spent 3 weeks on it, pulling in other neighbors, coordinating work crews, managing supplies. He did it with no particular fanfare and no expectation of acknowledgement, and when the young husband tried to express his gratitude in terms of debt owed, Cyrus said plainly that this was what people did for each other in a place like this, and there was nothing to pay back. Just pass it forward someday. Dorothy watched him say this from the porch and felt the full, rich weight of knowing exactly who she had married. In the spring of 1882, Dorothy discovered she was pregnant again. She told Cyrus in the same kitchen, at the same table, on an April evening 4 years after their wedding preparations had been underway in that same room, and his reaction was the same as the first time: the stillness, the bright eyes, both hands over both of hers. "Hello again," she said, meaning the feeling, meaning all of it. "Hello," he said, squeezing her hands. This baby was born in November, and this time the labor was faster and the autumn was cool and clear, and the baby arrived in the early morning hours with the particular quiet of a person who has decided to approach things at their own pace. It was a girl. Dorothy held her and looked at her small, ancient-looking face and felt the enormous love of it all over again, as immediate and overwhelming as the first time. "She looks like you," Cyrus said. "She has your eyes," Dorothy said. "That would be inconvenient," Cyrus said. "She will be too perceptive for her own good." Dorothy laughed and the baby opened her eyes at the sound, and they were exactly as dark and clear as Cyrus's. They named her Eleanor. Eleanor Margaret Brenner, the Margaret for James's sister, because Dorothy was a woman who believed in keeping threads connected even across long distances and complicated feelings. By the time Eleanor was born, Thomas was 13 and had developed opinions about cattle management that he was not shy about sharing, and some of them were actually quite good, which Cyrus acknowledged without condescension. Clara was 16 and had started at the Caldwell school, boarding with a respectable family during the week and coming home on Fridays on the stage, and her drawings were getting better than any of them had really expected, with a quality of observation and heart that made people stop and look and feel things. Baby James was 2 and had opinions about absolutely everything and no intention of keeping them to himself. And Dorothy Brenner, who had been Dorothy Shepard and had buried a good man and nearly lost everything, and made a choice in the middle of darkness that had turned out to be the most correct choice she had ever made, stood in the kitchen of the Brenner Shepard ranch on a November evening with her newborn daughter in her arms and her husband beside her, and listened to the sounds of her house, Thomas reading aloud to James from a picture book in the next room, the fire in the stove. The wind outside that knew how to behave here now because here had learned how to withstand it, and felt the full, completed weight of a life that had been broken and mended, and was now something stronger than it had been before, the kind of strength that comes not from having been protected from hard things, but from having walked through them with the right person beside you. Clara came home that Friday evening from Caldwell with new charcoal sticks in her bag, and a particular light in her eyes that Dorothy recognized as the look of a girl who has found what she is made for. She sat down at the table after supper and produced a new drawing, a large one, worked carefully and with intent, and she set it in the center of the table without explanation. It was the family, all of them, Dorothy at the center, the baby in her arms. Cyrus beside Dorothy, not towering over or in front of, but beside, exactly beside, his shoulder level with hers, his expression that expression of his steady, fully present, entirely honest. Thomas next to Cyrus with his chin up and his feet planted wide like a young man learning what it means to stand that way. James on the floor at their feet with the undignified glee of a 2-year-old, a leaner as a curve of blanket in Dorothy's arms. And Clara had drawn herself at the edge of the group, not peripheral. The composition was centered, and she was clearly part of it, but standing at an angle that suggested both belonging and the particular necessary independence of a young woman who knows who she is and where she came from and where she is going. Dorothy looked at the drawing for a long time. She felt Cyrus come and stand beside her. He looked at it too. Thomas looked over at it and said, "You made Cy look too serious. He makes a better face than that sometimes." "That is his real face," Clara said. "I draw what is actually there." Cyrus said, "Thank you, Clara." Clara said, "You are welcome, Cyrus." It was the first time she had said his name to him directly in exactly that way, unhurried and natural, and without the slight formality that had lived in it before, and the difference was quiet and unmistakable. Dorothy folded the drawing with the greatest care and put it in the trunk in the bedroom where she kept the most irreplaceable things: the photograph of James and her on their wedding day, the children's first shoes, the letter the bank had sent her confirming the paid debt, the small pressed flower Clara had put in her mother's hair on the day she married Cyrus. She put Clara's drawing in with all of those, and she pressed it flat, and she closed the trunk. Outside, the November stars were doing what they always did over the Kansas plain, spreading themselves out in that complete, indifferent abundance, each one its own complete thing, all of them together forming a pattern that only made sense from a distance. Inside, the fire was warm and the children were various states of awake and fed and loved, and Cyrus Brenner, who had ridden 60 miles to reach this ranch, who had crouched in the dust of this yard and told 2 grieving children the absolute truth, who had stayed when staying was the bravest and most chosen thing he could do, sat down at the kitchen table and looked up at his wife, and Dorothy Brenner sat down across from him with her newborn daughter sleeping against her chest. And they looked at each other across the same table where they had gone over ledgers and debt and plans and the honest hard math of survival. And they were, in every way that mattered, exactly where they were supposed to be. "Tell me something," Dorothy said. "What would you like to know?" he said. "Tell me something about you that I do not know yet," she said, "after all this time." He thought about it for a moment, the quiet, considered way he thought about everything. Then he said, "I used to think that a life like this, a home, children, all of it was something that happened to other people, something I had missed or been too late for or had simply not been made for." Dorothy waited. "And now," he said, "I think it is the only thing I was ever made for. I just needed to find the right place to do it." Dorothy held her daughter a little closer. She said, "So did I." The fire snapped and settled. Somewhere in the house Thomas had finished reading to James, and James had presumably fallen asleep, since the reading had stopped and the house was quiet. The November wind moved past the walls that had been built and reinforced, that knew how to hold against the weather now. And the life they had made, the 2 of them and their children inherited, chosen, born, and growing, held itself around them in the kitchen lamplight, complete and whole and full of everything that was still coming, all the mornings and the hard seasons and the good ones, the children growing up and going out and coming back, the ranch changing year by year under their hands, the love between them deepening the way water deepens a riverbed, slowly and thoroughly and without end. Outside on the horizon, barely visible through the kitchen window, the faintest edge of approaching winter clouds moved in the dark sky above the plain, And inside the Brenner Shepard ranch, nobody was afraid of the weather anymore. They had what they needed. They had each other. They were home.